Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm from Sweden, and the Swedish child welfare system is defined as a family support system rather than a child protection system. And adoption is not used as a child welfare message. Another difference is that children up to 18 are also, when engaged in criminal activities and using drugs, with very few exceptions, are the responsibility of child welfare. I will not take the time to talk about differences between child welfare systems, but talk about children in foster care. That's the most common out-of-home care. From Swedish as well as international research, we know that on a group level, children with experiences from foster care are less educated, have more health problems, are less well-being than children in the population, and are less successful as adults. Although this can be explained by severe home conditions and insufficient parental care before out-of-home placement, it's not unusual to think that foster care is the problem. Sometimes it is. And it's a progress that the authorities have. They are now more careful about choosing foster homes and controlling foster care. It's a progress that the authorities are obliged to listen to the children and include their perspective on matters concerning them. It's a progress that maintaining contact with the natural family is seen as in the best interest of the child, although not always practicable and sometimes troublesome for the foster family. In this seminar, I will talk about individual variation in a group of disadvantaged children with experiences from foster care. I will use my longitudinal research project about children in care as a basis for reflections on in-group variation and different outcomes of foster care for children with similar disadvantaged background. First, a few words about the research project, then my reflections. The primary study initiating the longitudinal project was an in-depth study of all the children 0 to 4 who were placed in the one remaining children's home in the city of Malmö at some time during a 2-year period in the 80s. And stayed there for at least 4 weeks while the family situation was investigated and family treatment offered, or a decision about foster care was made. Most of the children I'm talking about had a single mother addicted to alcohol or drugs and or suffering from mental illness. As for many children in out-of-home care, their parents had also a low level of education, were dependent on welfare benefit, had no supporting network, and destructive family relations. In the primary study, data from regular observations, interviews, social files, etc. were collected. Later, I carried through 7 waves of follow-up, 3 and 9 months after they left the children's home to return home or move to a foster home, and also 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25 years later. This means that I have a lot of information about these 26 children from the very beginning until young adults, 25 to 30 years old. The theme of this seminar is teenagers, and in my reflections I will put teenage in relation to younger age and also to their own retrospective view as young adults. So my first reflection is on stability. That's often used in research as an outcome of care. Seen over the years, most of the children in my study, as in other studies, have experienced instability in life. Breakdown in care and replacement after return home is not unusual. A quarter of the children in my study stayed with one of their parents after leaving the children's home. A quarter stayed with a foster family for most of their childhood. A quarter were in foster care for a few years and had a planned return home. But sorry to say, most of them were later replaced in foster care. A quarter returned home after children's home, but were later placed in foster care. That's how it is in other studies as well. However, for the experience of stability is not enough to look at the number of placements or moves. They have different meaning for different children. Most of the children staying with one of their parents were unhappy about instability because of the parents' moves and new partners. A few of those children staying in permanent foster care for 10 or 15 years initiated in spite of that breakdown late in their teens. Some of those who returned home and were later replaced did not feel instability because they were replaced in the same foster family as before, and they had kept in contact, and a few of them had even asked for the replacement. I feel a great deal of worry for instability, but want to point out the cooperation between adults as decisive for the children. When parents and foster carers, we used to say foster parents, cooperate well, the foster carers can keep in contact with the child after return home, and it's more likely that the children can return to the same foster home when replacement is necessary. Many foster families feel alone in their contacts with parents and demand more support from social workers. I think that's very important, especially when the children are teenagers and conflicts can be unmanageable. Not to forget that social workers' active interest and regular contact with individual children can also be decisive for children. It should be possible to reduce the negative consequences of instability by working for continuity in relationships. Even social workers can contribute to a feeling of continuity for children. As teenagers, some of the children in my study could give touching examples of the importance of a social worker, but also of total loneliness. Lack of professional continuity in child welfare is a problem, very much discussed in Sweden. My second reflection is on social adjustment in terms of school performance, work, and law-abidingness. Maybe social adjustment is the most common outcome criterion of care. It's well known that children with foster care experiences are less well educated as a group. In my study, as in other studies, fewer had upper secondary school than the population, but half of them had. I want to pay attention to the fact that many do well at school, and teachers and foster carers are satisfied with them, even if they themselves mean that they could do better or could have chosen a more demanding course. As teenagers, they have more problems to handle than other teenagers and are often excused for not living up to their capacity. As young adults, they felt sorry for that. Inspired by UK, there are now in many places in Sweden special school programs for foster children. And in evaluations are shown lower expectations on foster children, and that's no benefit for them. Those who had only compulsory school differ. In my study, some of those who left school in their teens did so not because of behavior problems, but school fatigue and inadequate certificates. A few of them found a job and managed life rather well. The circumstances were quite different for those who had shown behavior problems as early starters, had kept away from school and taken part in criminal activities. When I try to understand why some of them, but not others, with similar backgrounds started with drugs and criminal activities, I can't point out a single factor, but an interaction of risk factors. Foster carers could feel unsuccessful, and not until later, when the most problematic teenage years had passed, those foster parents who had not given up contact could see that they had made a difference. And as young adults, some of them could say, thanks to my foster parents who never gave up. My third reflection is on relationships, the family and foster family relationships. That's a more difficult outcome to catch, but maybe the most powerful. From the very beginning at the children's home, I had observed the children's attachment behavior to parents, because parents, usually the mothers, were encouraged to stay at the children's home daytime. In the 7 waves of follow-up relationships with family, foster family, and other important persons were part of interviews and questionnaires. When analyzing placements and relationships, I had to draw the conclusion that stability in placement is not the whole explanation of relationships, and that earlier assessment of mother-child relationships did not explain later relationships. I had to start from present time, that's to say, when the young adults, in their own perceptions of relationships, and go back from there to understand some relationships. Half of the young adults showed the attachment pattern known as secure, autonomous, free to evaluate. They were able to reflect on and realistically evaluate their emotional experiences, and also felt free to evaluate their parents and tolerate their imperfections. They have had relationships with their former foster parents that could be seen as secure, warm, and lasting. The other half of the young adults showed insecure relationship, were either preoccupied, entangled, or dismissive with respect to attachment. They talked about family and foster family relationships in an angry or ambivalent fashion, or showed avoidant, defensive, and dismissive patterns. Disappointments of parents and foster parents were not quite distinguishable, as if they were in interaction. When looking back on earlier rounds of follow-up, I found that it was not stability in placement or years in foster care that could totally explain relationship. Those with secure relationship had foster parents with an open attitude to the children's birth family. They made an effort to maintain contact with extended family when birth parents were absent. They talked about the birth parents in an accepting way. They listened to the children's disappointments, and helped them to work through disappointments and become reconciled with their family background, if they loved their parents or not. At the other end of the continuum, many of those categorized as having insecure relationships also had foster carers who had a more uninvolved or unaccepting attitude to the birth parents. Some of them saw it as in the best interest of the child to be restrictive about contact, and did not encourage children to talk about their background experiences. It's understandable, but it's obvious that children in care and after care need to work through their disappointments with parents' shortcomings and failure to take care of them. This is made easier when foster parents had an accepting, sensitive, and supportive attitude. However, I think it should not be left to foster carers alone to help children to work through disappointing experiences and be reconciled with their childhood. My fourth reflection is on well-being. Well-being is a complex concept and can be hard to catch because it's changeable, it depends on time, age, measure, if something has happened recently. I think that well-being is more vulnerable and changing for children in child welfare than for other children. As a matter of fact, I still think about how to write about well-being with all its complexity. It's too simplified to say that no psychiatric contacts or no drug problems means well-being. And it's not enough to ask about well-being at a certain point of time. Well-being can't be quite understood in relation to placement, history, or social adjustment, and include, of course, individual characteristics. I will not go into the many complications with measuring well-being, but will tell you about two of my reflections. One is about gender. Boys show more of extrovert behavior problems than girls, not least in their teens. And if they have criminal activities where feelings of well-being are not asked for, behavior is in focus. Girls without behavior problems are not asked about their feelings of well-being, as if well-behaving is identical with well-being. However, talking about feelings and shortage of well-being should be more encouraged, especially because foster children usually come from backgrounds where talking is not highly evaluated. The other reflection on well-being is from the narratives of the young adults. Even if they had good foster care experiences and a well-adjusted adult life, some of them told about incidents of depression, even thoughts of suicide, when sad things happened. For example, a separation, a grandmother's death, a mother's relapse into drug abuse or prison. And strong and unmanageable feelings could also follow the birth of a child, also for a few of the young men, awakening feelings from their own childhood. As young adults, they were still vulnerable, more than they themselves expected. And I would like to see a better awareness of adult vulnerability and easier access to support after leaving care. My fifth reflection is on satisfaction. Children's satisfaction with their foster family, service user satisfaction. When I try to understand why some were very satisfied and others were not, it's not surprising that it has more with relationships than the instability in placement or social adjustment to do. For example, some of those who had been engaged in drugs and criminal activities and had been taken into residential care in their teens had lost contact with their foster carers. None of them was important to me, a few of the young men said, but one or two said, it was a good time in my life, and some of the children in long-term foster care had initiated a breakdown in their teens because of conflicts, but a few of them talked about re-established relationships as young adults. For example, my former foster mother helped me very much when my child was born, a young woman said. I know that I can always turn to them to get a meal, or when everything seems chaotic, a young man said. More than half of the young adults kept in contact with their former foster family, and most of them were without reservation satisfied with their foster home or one of them. I will end with some of these voices. One said, my foster parents are my parents, and I've always said I could not have had it better. A second said, I couldn't have come to a better family. They put up with me all the time, despite everything. And the third said, my family, that's of course my foster family. They have been there all the time, also when I returned home in between. So that's my last words, and as you hear, I like to problemize, and I look further to hear your discussion. Thank you.